Well, good morning. Great to be with you. My name is Tim Clemens. I'm the lead pastor here at Grace City. We've been on holidays for a little while. Unfortunately, at the end of my holiday, on the very last day, I got sick. Apparently, my body couldn't handle like 7 days in a row on the beach. Don't ask me why. But if I now sound a little bit nasally and fluey, that's why. Hopefully it's not too much of a distraction as we jump in and think about this question, does God exist? Why don't you join me and let's ask God for his help as we consider this topic. Father, I thank you for the chance that we have to explore now the evidence for your existence. Some of us are here and we are believers, and yet some of us are here and either we're not sure, we have a hunch, or perhaps we're even convinced that you don't exist. I pray that you would empower me, speak through me, help me to clearly present the evidence for your existence, and then may you lead all of us to have the courage and the conviction to follow the evidence where it leads, and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, in 2007, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a book called A Secular Age. And in the book, he asks this question. He says, why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in 1500 in our Western society, while in 2000, many of us find this not only easy, but even inescapable? Right? Imagine someone asked you that question. How would you respond? Why was it that 500 years ago it was basically impossible not to believe in God, whereas today so many of us, perhaps even yourself, find that not only easy but basically inescapable? Well, my hunch is that if you were going to attempt to answer that question, you would probably give a version of what the academics call the secularization thesis. Now, you probably don't know it's called that, but most of us would say something like, well, yeah, 500 years ago, we used to believe in things like gods and spirits and fairies and that sort of thing. But these days, particularly since the Enlightenment, we've all become far more rational, and we've now got naturalistic explanations for all of the things that we used to attribute to spiritual powers. And so really, thanks to science, we don't need God anymore. Again, whether you realize it or not, that is a version of what academics call the secularization thesis. This is a theory that states that as societies progress and modernize, particularly through science and technological advancements, religion will start to fade into the background and eventually will actually just disappear. And so according to the secularization thesis, atheism is the inevitable result of societies that progress and modernize. Now, again, even if people in our culture don't know that that's what it's called, the secularization thesis, I think it's a fairly common way of understanding the society that we live in. And so therefore, it's no surprise that stories of deconversion, by which I mean giving up any form of religious faith, are often framed as heroic coming out stories. And you can actually read a bunch of these online. I've read a handful. I just want to share one with you now. It's by a guy named Luke. I've read it on the website Common Sense Atheism. But just have a listen to how Luke describes his coming out, if you like. He's grown up in a religious family. I don't know what religion, but he's grown up in a religious family. And the whole time he's sort of experienced doubts. And then one day he just decides, no, I've got to face reality. Look what he says. He says, every time I reached out for some reason, any reason to believe, God simply wasn't there. I tried to believe despite the evidence, but I couldn't believe a lie. Not anymore. I'd stubbornly resisted my deconversion, but these days I'm excited to accept reality. Right, notice that for Luke, deconversion was about having the courage to face the facts and no longer rely on faith, which he goes on to describe as a gullible weakness, but to face up to reality. You might be here and have a similar story like that. I tried to believe for many years, but I just couldn't avoid the evidence, and these days I'm excited to face the facts. Now, one of the most powerful aspects of this narrative is the way that it contrasts the person with religious faith with the atheist. Because in this narrative, oftentimes religious faith is described as, sort of framed, if you like, as something for the weak and the gullible. It's for those people who can't face up to the fact that we live in a meaningless universe. It's for those people who need to believe that the suffering that they're experiencing isn't random but has a deeper meaning to it. It's for those kinds of people. where again, in this narrative, the atheist is often framed as the courageous hero, the one with the guts to stand on the edge of a meaningless universe, and rather than getting sucked into the search for another world, instead they can stand there and embrace the freedom to create their own meaning, write their own destiny. It's a very, very compelling story, because in this way of thinking, the atheist is really about coming of age. It's about growing up and throwing off the faith of a bygone era, or perhaps your parents, and stepping into the unknown to write your own destiny. I don't know about you, but framed like that, I'm kind of tempted to be an atheist, because that sounds awesome. I want to be the courageous hero. But here's the thing. Taylor, in his 2007 work, which I mentioned before, says, you know what, I'm not buying it. He won the 2007 Templeton Prize, which is a book award, for saying so. And since him, actually a number of other academics have come out as well, questioning this whole secularization thesis. Because Taylor says, you know, as compelling as it is, it's just far too simplistic. And it doesn't make sense of all the facts, because it's not the case that barely anyone believes anymore. It's certainly not the case that only dumb people believe. But if the secularization thesis was true, then you would expect religious faith to have basically disappeared, but it just hasn't happened. And so instead, Taylor says that we live in what he calls a cross-pressured world. Right, so 500 years ago, you could barely believe in God, but unlike that, most people did believe in God, but unlike that, these days we live in a world where both atheism and theism are valid options. And so, there might be more atheists today than there were 500 years ago. No one's going to deny that. But if you just check out the Australian census for 2016, 60% of us still claim some religious faith, which means atheism, if that's right, is still in the minority. But what it does mean is that we live in a time where everything is contested. And so the believer is now tempted to doubt, and the skeptic is tempted to believe. This morning, I'm going to proceed assuming that Taylor's analysis of our culture is correct. And that if you're here as a believer, maybe, just maybe, there are times when you're actually tempted to doubt the existence of God. But likewise, if you're here as an atheist, that maybe, just maybe, there might be times when you're tempted to believe. And so therefore, the question of God's existence is actually a real live issue for all of us in the room this morning. Now, before we get into the evidence for God's existence or not, let me just get some clarity on the kind of answer that we can realistically expect from a question like this. See, it's not uncommon for someone like an atheist to say, look, because I've arrived at my conclusions based on the evidence that there is no God, I'm happy to change my position and believe that there is a God. But in order for me to do that, you, believer, need to provide the evidence that's going to convince me to change. Now, that sounds like a reasonable request, but I want to suggest it's problematic for at least two reasons. And the first is that it's the issue of proof. Right? Typically, when an atheist asks for rock-solid proof, what they will be asking for is the kind of proof that nobody whose logical faculties are working could possibly deny. But here's the thing. It's not exactly clear what that kind of proof would be. You see, proving the existence of God is not like proving that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Right? Can you even provide physical proof for a spiritual being? I'm not sure. But the point is, it's not clear whether it's actually possible to provide proof for God that everyone in this room whose logical faculties are working is going to agree upon. But furthermore, when an atheist demands solid proof that God exists, it's often because they have come to the conclusion prior to making the claim that you should only believe things that you can prove to be true. But that itself is a problematic statement because the statement doesn't meet its own conditions, by which I mean you can't prove that the only things you should believe are the things that you can prove. Right? It's a circular statement, even if that doesn't make any sense. We also believe all sorts of things that we can't actually prove in the same way that we can prove that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So think about human rights. My hunch, it's a hunch, but my hunch is that you believe that humans have an inherent worth and dignity. Why? Well, you can't prove it. And yet that hasn't stopped entire societies being built on this conviction. Right? The American Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, they're saying that, all right, even though you can't prove them to be true, it doesn't mean they're not true. They're self-evident. And so we all believe things that we can't prove to be true, which leads on to the second real challenge of the atheist's usual demand for hardcore proof. And that is, in the same way that we can't definitively prove God's existence, you also can't definitively prove God's non-existence, which means atheism is also a kind of faith. See, we need to be really clear what is actually going on here. The secularization thesis makes it sound like that atheism is what happens when you suck up all the faith in the world. So modernism comes through and it just clears out the faith, and what are you left with? Atheism, no faith. But that's not actually what's going on. What's actually happening is that the atheist is exchanging one set of beliefs, the belief that there is a God, for another set of beliefs, the belief that there is no God. And so atheism is itself a kind of faith. Now, even if it doesn't naturally tend to think of itself this way, it is, because it has its own doctrines and assumptions, heretics and heroes. It just draws its lines in different places to that which I might, or perhaps you might, if you're here and a believer. See, this is one of the major problems with the new atheism movement. I don't know if you've heard of Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is very famous for one of his books in particular, which is called The God Delusion. A friend of mine gave me that book when I was at university, atheist friend. We had big debates, does God exist, does he or not? Honestly, I wasn't really sure what to do with the book when I was at university because I found it all a little bit intimidating. But since then, I've read a handful of people, some of whom are atheists, critiquing the new atheism and pointing out some of the problems with it. And just take a look at what Terry Eagleton says. He's not a believer. He's a Marxist scholar. Just look at what he says critiquing Dawkins. He says Dawkins considers that all faith is blind faith and that Christians and Muslim children are brought up to believe unquestioningly. Not even the dim-witted clerics who knocked me about at grammar school thought that. For mainstream Christianity, reason, argument, and honest doubt have always played an integral role in belief. Now, reason, to be sure, doesn't go all the way down for believers, but it doesn't for most sensitive, civilized, non-religious types either. Even Richard Dawkins lives more by faith than by reason. And so we hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. Here's my point. It doesn't matter whether you're here today and you call yourself a theist, you believe in God, or an atheist, you don't believe in God, or maybe you're somewhere in between. It doesn't matter, because neither of us can definitively prove or disprove the existence of God, at least not in the sense that we're all going to agree upon. We all come to our convictions through a combination of both reason and faith. And so therefore, we need to be clear on what kind of an answer we can expect from the question, does God exist? We're not this morning looking for watertight, case-closed proof, the kind that no other possible explanation is for. Rather, what we're looking for is courtroom conviction kind of proof, right? Evidence that leads to a verdict, as they say in the movies. Evidence that leads to, beyond reasonable doubt, the conclusion that God does or he doesn't exist. That's what we're after. Evidence beyond reasonable doubt. And so therefore this morning I'm going to proceed by offering you three different kind of bits of evidence, which for me at least, and I'll leave you to decide whether you agree or not, lead me to conclude beyond reasonable doubt that God does exist. They are, first of all, the origins of the universe. Second of all, the inbuilt sense of morality that I think we all share. And then third, and I believe most importantly, the person of Jesus Christ. So that's where we're going this morning. I'm going to jump in with this first big piece of evidence, which is the origins of the universe. Now, you may be aware that from Greek philosophy like Aristotle and Plato, those guys, right through to some of the Christian philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, the idea of causality has been very important. You say, what is causality? Causality is basically the idea that if something begins to exist, it must have been caused by something outside of it that pre-existed it, right? If something begins to exist, it must have been caused by something outside of it that pre-existed it. You're like, what do you mean? Think about yourself. You haven't always existed, right? You exist because many moons ago your parents fell in love, they lit some candles, and the rest is history. Something caused you to come into existence. But if you think about it, logically and philosophically speaking, you cannot have an infinite chain of causes. If you go back far enough into infinity, there is going to be a point where something caused the first cause. And so there must be an uncaused causer, an unmoved mover is what Aristotle called it. That's the thing that always was and that started everything else. Which naturally leads to the question, what's that? Now, for most of history, the answer of the atheist has been, well, the universe, right? The universe is the uncaused cause that caused it all. And for the most part, that's been very difficult to question because there wasn't any evidence to the contrary. But then in 1929, a guy named Edwin Hubble, came along with his telescope, and he made one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century, which is that the universe is expanding. And so what Hubble saw is that the galaxies are moving away from each other. And so he deduced what modern cosmology now seems to have confirmed, which is that all galaxies, stars, planets, energy, matter had a common source of origin. And then something like 15 billion years ago, there was a big bang and everything exploded out. And that's how our universe came into existence. But here's what that means. It means that the universe cannot be the uncaused cause that caused everything else, because the universe, just like yourself, had a birthday. So what are the implications of this? Well, have a listen to what a Christian scientist, but he was the director of the Human Genome Project, is a guy named Francis Collins, really, really intelligent guy. He says the Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. Right? It forces the conclusion that nature, if you like the universe, had a definite beginning. Only a supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. In other words, Francis Collins says that the Big Bang points beyond reasonable doubt in the direction of a creator, in a God. What I find interesting, though, is the fact that it's often the case that atheists don't like to go in that direction, where the evidence leads. Because you know what the working hypothesis was from Stephen Hawking before he died on the cause of the Big Bang? Nothing. It's literally called the nothing hypothesis. What caused it? Well, nothing. Now, I am certain that Hawking was a brilliant man. He's far more intelligent than I. Don't hear me questioning that. But the nothing hypothesis is not technically a scientific theory, and to me it just feels lazy. Right, because nothing is what I say when my daughter Brooke cries and I can't be bothered to go and check on her. You know, she cries, my wife's like, what's that? I'm like, nothing. Nothing to see here. Let's keep watching TV. It's just lazy. Again, I'm sure Hawking has his own ideas, but I can't help but feel like some atheists are guilty of doing what they so often accuse the theist of doing, which is ignoring the evidence that doesn't fit with their preconceived theories about metaphysics, about God, if you like. So let's ask ourselves the question, all right, well, that's the atheist account of the origins of the universe. What's the Christian account? The theist account. It's fairly simple. It just says that God was the pre-existent cause that started it all. And if you want to ask the schoolyard question, well, who created God? You don't really need to ask that question because remember, the idea is that every cause, everything that begins to exist must have a cause. But if you trace it back far enough, there must be an uncaused cause that started it all. And so the question is not, is there an uncaused cause? The question is, what is that uncaused cause? The Christian says it's God, because it's clearly not the universe, because the universe had a birthday. But suppose we want to take it one step further and say, well, let's not just give a theistic account, because lots of people, or the religions, if you like, would say that. Is there a specifically Christian account? Well, to begin with, we might point to Genesis 1:1, which says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And therefore, if the Big Bang really did happen, and current evidence seems to suggest that it did, clearly it was God's doing. Right? God said, let there be light, and then bang, everything we see has come about through God's guidance and direction. But in fact, the Bible says that the evidence from creation leaves people like you and I without excuse. Take a look at Romans chapter 1, verse 20. Paul here writes that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, things like his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. He's saying there is enough evidence in creation for people like you and I to conclude beyond reasonable doubt that there is a powerful divine creator being out there. Now, if you say, well, hang on, if that's true, why doesn't everyone agree? In the next couple of verses, Paul goes on to say, but we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, if that's true, what he's actually saying is that if you're here and you believe that there is no God, there may actually be, your reasons for doing so may actually be ethical rather than rational. What he would say is that you're suppressing the truth. Now, John Lennox is a great apologist, and he's got this cheeky little saying. It's cheeky, but I'll just warn you. He says, atheists like to say that Christianity is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. I suggest that atheism is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the light. In other words, maybe, just maybe, you don't want there to be a God, because if there was, you'd have to face up to him, and that idea scares you. I don't know what you think about that. I'll leave that with you. But at least where I'm standing from, to me, the evidence from the origins of the universe seem to lead me, beyond reasonable doubt, to conclude that God does exist. That's that first kind of area that I wanted to explore with you. The second area I'd love to explore with you now is this idea of our inbuilt sense of morality. And so as we jump into this, C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity is reflecting on what people say when they wrong each other. And he says this. He says, they say things like, how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? Leave me alone. He's not doing you any harm. Or, come on, you promised. Now, people say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behaviour does not happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behaviour which he expects the other man to know about. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behaviour or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. In this second idea, I want to spend a bit of time thinking about where does that come from? Where does our morality come from? And as we do it, we'll explore the atheist account first and then the theistic account. So what do the atheists say? Well, the atheist would say most of the time that our sense of morality comes down to us through Darwinian evolution. And so the logic goes that altruistic people who acted unselfishly and cooperatively survived in greater numbers than those who were selfish and cruel. And so those altruistic genes have sort of been passed down to us, which is why I suspect most of us in the room think that it's right to be nice to people and it's wrong to be cruel. That's where morality has come from. Now, if you think about it, for a while it starts to make sense, but as I've reflected on it, I'm not so sure it does, because the more you think into it, I think you start to see a handful of problems with it. And the first is that I'm not convinced that the logic works. Just think about it with me. If someone today falls into a river, most of us in the room are going to jump in afterwards to save them, or at the very least feel guilty about the fact that we haven't jumped in to save them. Am I right? But you've got to ask, where would that come from? Because way back, the people who had that inclination to jump in and save someone in a river are more likely to die out than the selfish people who'd like to stand on the safety of the riverbank. And so they're more likely to survive than the selfless people. But how does that work if the genes come down to us through evolution? So I'm not sure that the logic works, because today that sort of altruism is alive and well. But the second reason I'm not sure it works is that I don't think it corresponds with reality. It doesn't correspond with reality, because again, I think most of us in the room today would say that what Hitler and the Nazis did was absolutely morally wrong and evil. Right? To wipe out and exterminate over 6 million Jews isn't just wrong because evolution has socially conditioned us to think it's wrong. It's actually wrong. It's absolutely wrong. But the problem for the atheist is that their worldview gives no rational explanation for why that's the case. I'm not saying, please don't hear me saying, I'm not saying that if you're here as an atheist that you must think it's not wrong that what Hitler did. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is that your worldview gives you no explanation for why that's the case. Because actually, according to your worldview, what Hitler and the Nazis did was just natural selection at work. It was the strong killing the weak so that the strong could survive. And if it's true, as your worldview would suggest, that we are just slightly more evolved animals, why do you have such double standards? Because you don't hold sharks or other animals accountable for killing each other. Why do you hold humans accountable for killing one another? Is it just because you think, oh, well, society wouldn't work if we didn't? Is it just because you think, well, if I was the victim in that situation, I'd want someone to come in and protect me, and so it's actually sort of a selfish motivation? Or is it because you think that what they're doing is actually wrong? If you want to say that what Hitler and the Nazis did was actually, that is, absolutely wrong, we need a moral absolute to appeal to. We need a higher moral standard outside of ourselves that can call people accountable to. But the thing is, atheism denies that possibility. And so therefore, it can't say that what Hitler and the Nazis did was actually wrong. In fact, for an atheist to say that it's absolutely wrong to be cruel, absolutely right to be nice, is just a wild leap of faith in the dark against all evidence to the contrary. So that's how an atheist might address the question of our inbuilt sense of morality. How would the theist account for it? Well, the theist says that the world and you and I were created by an absolute personal being, that's God, and therefore there is such a thing as moral absolutes, moral absolutely right, absolutely wrong. But the Christian account goes further, because what the Christian account says is that when God created you, he actually wrote onto your heart the requirements of his law. And so you can see this testified to in your conscience. Take a look at what Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 14 to 15. He says, when those who do not have the law, now he's talking here about the Gentiles who are non-Jews, because the law is like the Ten Commandments. And so he's saying, when the non-Jews who didn't have the Ten Commandments do by nature the things required by the law, that is the Ten Commandments, what they show is that the requirements of those laws are written on their hearts, and their conscience also bearing witness. And so when you see someone who didn't have the Ten Commandments, to a large extent living as if they are true, you've got to ask, well, where's that come from? He says it's from God writing the requirements of his law on their hearts. Now, if you say, well, hang on, how come we don't all agree on what's right and wrong then? The Bible would say that it's because sin actually sears our conscience, and so it impedes our ability to correctly read God's moral requirements. But at the very least, the fact that the majority of us in this room this morning know intuitively that it's wrong to rape, murder, commit pedophilia, to steal, to hurt, testifies, I think, to the truth and explanatory power of the Christian account of our morality. We feel that these things are wrong because they are wrong. They are wrong for every person in every nation at every time period because God wove right and wrong into the fabric of creation. Now again, I'm not saying that if you're here and you're an atheist, you must be a horrible person. I have lots of atheist friends. Most of them are really nice. I'm also not saying that if you are an atheist, you must think that what Hitler and the Nazis did wasn't wrong. Again, you might. But I'm saying that that doesn't follow logically or coherently from your worldview. And so that's a wild leap of faith in the dark, the thing that Christians are often accused of doing. All right, this morning, we're asking the question, does God exist? And so far I've been saying that I believe that theism makes more sense of the available evidence than atheism does. But I reckon even if I'd managed to convince you at this point in the talk that God does, beyond reasonable doubt, exist, I think if I stopped here, I would be doing you a massive disservice. And that is because there is a big difference between knowing that God exists and actually knowing God himself. Think about it. When the orphan grows up, their whole life, believing that their parents were dead, suddenly discovers that their parents are in fact alive, what do? Just keep living their life as if nothing's happened? Of course not. They will do everything they can to be reconciled with their parents who brought them into the universe. I think it's the same with God. Once you reach a point where you conclude beyond reasonable doubt that God exists, you'd be crazy not to do everything you can to get to know this God who's brought you into existence. And so that's the reason that I want to finish with this third and final point, which is the person of Jesus. See, I said at the start that there really isn't any watertight, case closed kind of proof for the existence of God, and I stand by that. But the thing is, Christianity, even though it doesn't give you a watertight proof, it does actually give you a watertight person. Because the claim of Christianity is that you get to know God through his Son, Jesus Christ. And so take a look at what Jesus says about himself in John chapter 14, verse 8 and 10. One of his disciples is named Philip, and so Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father," that's God, "and that will be enough for us." Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I'm in the Father and that the Father's in me? But the words I say to you, I don't speak in my own authority. Rather, it's the Father living in me who is doing his work." Jesus says, anyone who's seen me has seen God. And so if you want to get to know God, you've got to get to know me. Now, you might be sitting there and saying, that doesn't prove anything. That's just some wild claim, right? You can claim anything you want to. I've got a crazy uncle. He thinks he's God. No one believes him. And you'd be right. To claim something doesn't make it true. And so actually, all of the founders of the world's major religions have made massive claims. Now, none of them go to the extent that Jesus did. None of them claim to be God himself. But they also make big claims, right? Muhammad, founder of Islam, claimed to have heard the voice of the angel Gabriel, saying write, and then he writes out the Quran, and he passes on those teachings to his disciples, and Islam is born. It's a big claim. Or Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, claims to have had a moment of enlightenment under a Bodhi tree, and then he passes those teachings on to his disciples, and Buddhism is born. Right? You can claim whatever you like, but claiming something doesn't make it true. Here's the thing, Jesus knows that, which is why, in the very next verse, take a look at what he says. This is now verse 11. It's in the green. "Believe me when I say that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves." You see what he's saying? The works there are his reference to his miracles, the chief among them being the resurrection. What he's saying is, look, you should just believe what I'm saying on the basis of me saying it, but even if you can't, that's okay, because I want you to look at the evidence, and that, in particular, the evidence from the resurrection. And so not even Jesus wants his followers to have blind faith. He says, take a look at the evidence and then figure out what you believe. See, every other religion will ask you to believe in some voice inside a prophet's head. Christianity asks you to believe in the guy who claimed to be God. Massive claim, but then rose from the dead to back it up. John Dixon, who teaches a course in the historical Jesus just over at Sydney University, puts it like this. He says, look, the logic is simple. If you say that something spectacular took place on the stage of history, thoughtful people are going to ask you historical questions. It's as if Christianity happily places its neck on the chopping block of public scrutiny and invites anyone who wishes to come and take a swing. He's saying, look, Christianity makes historical claims. It says something happened in history, the resurrection, which means you can go and suss that out. You can look at the records. It's potentially falsifiable, because if you can show it didn't happen, Christianity is all made up. Now, we don't have the time this morning for me to go through and present all the evidence for the resurrection. I would encourage you to try that for yourself. But might I present to you that if you do take the time to look at the historical evidence for the resurrection, what you will find is a resurrection-shaped hole in the historical record. It's hard to see how it got there if it didn't actually happen. Which means that Jesus was who he said he was, God in the flesh. And that if you want to get to know God, you've got to get to know Jesus. Let me finish. One of the most powerful narratives of our culture, we've said, is that of the atheist hero, right? Throwing off the ignorant beliefs of a previous generation, having the guts to face reality and to embrace the freedom to create their own destiny. It's a really compelling narrative. I'm just not convinced it's true. Because at least from where I'm standing, the evidence from the origins of the universe, our inbuilt sense of morality, and the person of Jesus Christ lead me at least to conclude beyond reasonable doubt that God does exist. And therefore, I wonder if actually today's heroes are those with the courage to face up to the facts, to follow that evidence where it leads, even if it means throwing off the ignorant beliefs of a culture that thinks God is dead. In my books, the true hero is the one with the courage to admit that God's not dead, that he's alive and well, and then, like the orphan, to embark on the thrilling journey of getting to know the one that brought them into existence. And so if you are here today, to my atheist friends, again, so great to have you with us, but I want to say, be the hero. Have the courage to follow the evidence where it leads, because God in Christ is literally dying to be reconciled to you. Why don't you join me? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you haven't left us without evidence for your existence. We see in creation that it is the handiwork. We see your fingerprints everywhere, and it testifies to your divine majesty and your power. We also know from our conscience that you've written the requirements of your law on our hearts, and so we know that as we stand before you, we're without excuse. But more than that, we thank you for sending your Son, the person Jesus Christ, into this world so that we might actually know you and have a relationship with you. And we thank you that Jesus coming into the world wasn't simply about revelation, revealing you to us, but about salvation, so that he would go to the cross to die to make it possible for us, your orphan children, to be brought back into relationship with you. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay. Let's continue all those awesome conversations in the Freedom Hub. So we have a bunch of questions, very interesting ones, very tricky ones as well. So looking forward to it. You guys ready? Awesome. Ready. So you guys know Tim. You've already met him. This is Kate. Kate studied theology for 4 years and works at Cru, and is here to help us answer some questions. So I'm excited. No fist bump this time? No. Okay.
Tim fist bumped me at 9 a.m, but I missed it because I wasn't.
You just left me hanging the whole time. I was like, in front of everyone.
So, first question, question one. Some Christians suggest that the Bible says that the earth is about 6,000 years old. How does that fit with science and the fact that, Tim, you said the Big Bang Theory happened about 15 billion years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, one that often lots of people have. I guess my first thought is, in the case of that question, I think it's more a reframing. So I think people will often look at the Bible and say, you know, why doesn't it give us more scientific detail, or why doesn't it tell us exactly how old the earth is, or when Jesus is coming back, like what year will that happen? But I think particularly the start of the Bible very clearly shows us who God is and who we are, not kind of what order everything happened in. So I think the question that it's trying to answer is, why are we here? Why does the world exist? Why do we exist? Not necessarily how old exactly is the world, and where did the dinosaurs come? Where did tectonic plates come? Kind of how did all of that work? Which is a bit tricky, but I think it's not trying to answer that question. Yeah, which is important to know.
So the why as opposed to the how.
Yeah.
It's worth saying as well that some of the clues that that's the case, the first one would be, I think the way that most people conclude the whole 6,000-year-old Earth idea is by counting the genealogies. So, this person lived for that long, plus that long, plus that long, that equals about 6,000 years, therefore. But biblical genealogies, and you can tell this really obviously in Matthew chapter 1, but they are often very selective. They skip things. It's not supposed to be this complete chain of people right back to Adam. It's more representative, and it's telling us something. But the second thing is just to pay attention to what the genre of the literature is. And so particularly Genesis chapter 1, which talks about the creation of the world in 6 days, that's poetry, not prose. And it's very clear as you read it through. And poetry, it's still telling the truth, but it's not a science textbook. And so it's quite clear as you actually read through it. It begins by saying the world was formless and empty, and then it proceeds to list out 6 days where God creates. And each time it's formless and empty, so he creates something and then he fills it. And so, for example, on day 1 and then on day 4, day 1 is he creates the night and the dark, the day and the night, but then it's on day 4 that he creates the 2 lights, the sun and the moon. And you're like, that doesn't even work logically. And so that's a clue. And you see the same thing on day 2, day 4, day 3, day 6. It's a clue that what's going on here is poetry more so than scientific explanation for how it all came into existence.
That's really helpful. So off the back of that, then how do we... So you said that you didn't really have time to go into the evidence of the resurrection, but talking about the Bible not being scientific necessarily, how would you approach that? So maybe you can share with us a few of the evidences that you have of the resurrection?
Yeah. So you pay attention to the genre. So in the first chapter of the Bible, it's poetry. It's quite clear that the Gospels are presenting themselves as historical literature, as kind of biographical accounts of this person, Jesus. So that's just a heads up. But in terms of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, 4 things come to mind. The first is the fact that the tomb was empty. And so if it wasn't empty, all the leadership would have to do is go, here's the body of Jesus. He clearly didn't rise from the dead. But they couldn't do that. Now, you might say, well, it's because the disciples stole the body. That was actually, according to Matthew, one of the Gospels, that was a rumor that was circulated by the authorities at the time. But it doesn't quite make sense because the second piece of evidence is that each of the disciples, or at least 11 out of the 12 disciples, go on to be martyred for refusing to deny that Jesus rose from the dead. And you go, why would they do that, right? It's one thing to die for something you think is true but actually isn't. It's another thing entirely to die for something you know is false because you made it up. And yet that's what they all do. Third, you say, well, maybe it was sort of hallucination. Maybe they just saw what they wanted to see. I don't even know if that's possible with 11 people, but it's definitely not possible with more. And so Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, look, he appeared to X, Y, and Z, and then at one point, Jesus appeared to 500 people at one time, and actually most of them were alive. His implication there is, if you don't believe me, go and ask them. And then the fourth and final piece is the fact that the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection in all of the different gospel accounts are women. And that's not particularly notable in our society. But in the first century, the testimony of a woman wasn't accepted in court. And so just think about this. If you're in the first century, you're trying to make up a religion to convince Jewish people that a Jewish man rose from the dead, and the testimony of women isn't counted as legal testimony, you're not going to say that women were the first eyewitnesses unless they actually were. It's kind of, in the first century, actually an embarrassing part of the testimony. And so the only reason you'd include that in the gospel accounts is if it actually happened. So I think there are a few reasons why it's helpful to believe.
When I became a Christian, this was kind of what got me over the line. So I didn't grow up going to church or knowing much about Jesus. And for me, I kind of make decisions based on lists and facts and pretty much have zero intuition. But I think for me, looking at the historical evidence was something that I didn't realise that there was so much of, and I didn't really realise how highly historians, both Christians and non-Christians, hold the gospel manuscripts. I kind of thought, of course the Christians are behind it, but nobody else is. But actually, even non-Christian historians hold those manuscripts really highly. And there's a guy called Charles Colson who worked for President Nixon when Watergate happened, and he ended up going to jail. He was one of the few people that did. And in jail, he became a Christian through a prison Bible study. And after he got out, he went on this speaking tour, and he kind of used his situation as a bit of an example for the reliability of the New Testament, because he said, there were 7 of us, including the president. We had so much money, so much power, and yet we couldn't keep to the same story. We couldn't keep a secret for more than a week. And kind of his point was, if hundreds of people said exactly the same thing about what happened to Jesus in a time where they had no money, they had no power, he kind of goes, how could they have all kept to that same story to the point that they were willing to die for it when we kind of crumbled after a week and all ended up in jail? So that's kind of always stuck in my head.
Yeah, thanks. So just 2 last questions that are a little bit related. First, from a Christian perspective, how are we supposed to approach doubt as Christians? What is a helpful way to approach doubt?
I reckon people often think of doubt as a negative thing, but I actually think doubt is usually a positive thing because it means that you're engaging your brain and your faith with what's happening in the world around you. So in City Kids, we teach the kids that asking questions and having doubts is actually a really good thing, and as they get older that will happen even more and more, because actually for all of us, just the things that happen to us, the way that we live, our faith needs to grow with that. And so I think actually if you have doubts, the best thing you can do is kind of address them and not view them as a negative. And yeah, I think take active steps to talk to people and figure it out. I don't think the Bible wants us to have blind faith, but actually wants us to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have, but also just be able to think about what's kind of happening to us and engage with that.
Good.
Thanks, Kay. And the last part is from a non-believing perspective. Let's say I believe there is, so it's a quote, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on the quote. Let's say I believe there is something out there, but I don't want it. I don't want to follow God. I'm having a good life without him, her, it.
So
comment.
Yeah.
So what? What for?
Yeah. I'll answer from the Christian perspective, from the Jesus perspective, if you like. I'll start with a carrot, but there's a stick. The carrot is Jesus says he's come that you might have life to the full. And so I am going to totally butcher the quote, but C.S. Lewis says something to the effect of, where like kids, we're double-minded like kids mucking around building mud piles in the slums, not realising that just over the road is a offer of a holiday by the sea. We're messing around with drink and sex. We're just far too easily pleased. And the idea seems to be, all right, you might be having a great time, like a kid does in the slums, playing mud piles. But the message of the Bible is that there's a holiday on the sea, a holiday by the sea on offer, not just in the future, but actually in this life. Jesus came to offer life to the full. So that would be the carrot, if you like. But you can't ignore the fact that there's a stick. And we dealt last week, if you were here, with the problem of hell. Jesus says that one day we will meet him face to face. And those who trusted in him and his work on the cross for them will be raised to new life, never to die again, live with him for all eternity. And last week we saw a hard reality of the Christian teaching is that those who don't put their trust in Jesus will not experience that, but will spend eternity in hell. So there is carrot and stick in this, I think.
Thank you. Well, that brings our questions and answers time to an end. Now, this is the end of the formal part of questions and answers, but I hope you guys continue and feel free to continue these conversations once we're done with the formal part of our service in the Freedom Hub. If you are someone who's engaging with these questions and really struggling through them, we'd love to offer you this book. It's called The Problem of God, which, of course, is where the series name comes from. Feel free to pick this up and to go to the info desk at the Freedom Hub and pick one of these copies up.